Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gregor Larson. He is a professor in the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford and director of the Wellcome Trust Paleogenomics and Bio-Archaeology Research Network. His research interests include evolutionary genomics, ancient DNA, domestication, human and animal dispersal, and phylogenetics. His work on the domestication of canines and the origin of the domestic dog has provided insights into the prehistoric bond between humans and early dogs. And today we're going to talk about some of the history of and evolution of domestication. So, Dr. Larson, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
No, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Pleasure's all mine, really.
Okay, great. So, do we know exactly when animal domestication started?
No, we do not. We have some vague bounds. I think that's probably the best way to talk about it. And it really is very taxa specific. So, and we also don't really have a very good understanding of what we mean by domestication. It's one of those words that everybody has an intuition about. You go home to a cat or a dog or a fish or a turtle or whatever you've got in your house, and you don't have a problem thinking of that animal as having a close relationship to you and therefore being some kind of domesticated realm. But what that process is of how that looks like, of how those animals come to be in those relationships and how humans form those relationships with people or with other animals is not anywhere near as clear cut as the intuition of having them right now would seem to suggest.
Okay, but even if it's not clear cut, what are some, from a scientific perspective, what are some of the sources of evidence that we have at our dispersal at our disposal to study domestication?
So, yeah, well, there's at least that's the upside, is that there's quite a few different ways to look at this. And what we're always looking for is proxies, right? So what effectively we're looking for is changes in the relationships between two different species. That's humans on one side and then whatever species X you want to put on the other side. And describing those relationships becomes difficult if you are just doing very superficial things. But then once that relationship starts to change, it's like the relationship between any two humans. Like, so for example, if you meet somebody you've never met before and then you start living with them, there will be certain signatures of that relationship that you have with them. You might have a joint bank account. You might then share a grocery bill where you're eating the same thing every night. So the isotopic signatures of the hairs on your head or the rest of your tissue will start to mirror each other. And so what we're really looking for is trying to see if we can find reliable proxies that we can be confident reflect that shifting relationship, which effectively goes from a period of being either wary or not super reliant on a population to having mutually symbiotic and very heavily reliant upon those two things. And so we, in our lab, we generate a lot of ancient data from the genomes, from mitochondria and nuclear genomes, and that allows us to look at patterns of relationships through time and the geographic spread of different haplotypes through time, and also just what the ancestry proportions of different animals are through space and time relative to wild populations. And that can give us a perspective on things like bottlenecks and selection and timing and those kinds of things. We also use archaeological evidence, which often comes in the form of the bones that the animals are leaving behind. So we were just reading a paper this morning. We're working on a big pig project, and there's a site in Vietnam where more than 3/4 of all the bones recovered from a particular site are all pigs. Well, that's probably not going to be true unless you have a population of pigs that are living in very close proximity to those people, and those people are reliant upon that population. And so and then the other thing is that more than 3/4 of those bones are from pigs that are less than 2 years old. So by doing that sort of analysis, you can then start to infer the kinds of process, because most of those pigs are being slaughtered before they're two. And that's giving you an insight into how those people and those pigs are interrelated at that particular site at that particular time. And that's giving you a perspective on the kinds of life ways and the kinds of cultures and the kinds of agricultural practices that those people are doing. And if you kind of spread that out across space and time and look at a whole bunch of different people and a whole bunch of different animals, you can start to kind of piece together how this relationship emerges, develops, and then becomes now wholly reliant upon where you have this mutual reliance where the number of these animals just goes through the roof, and the whole modern civilizations are predicated upon having a foundation or a baseline of a lot of different domestic animals.
Right. So, I mean, when talking about genetics, you mentioned studying mitochondrial DNA. So, could you tell us why mitochondrial DNA specifically? I mean, is it that through it you can study certain specific things that you couldn't through, let's say, nuclear DNA?
Yeah, I mean, every proxy you use for anything is always going to have an upside and a downside. And what's great about mitochondria is that it's a single non-recombining locus, which means that it is just replicated from mother to daughter all the way through. It's only maternally inherited. I mean, every time we say that about biology, that's not true. There is such a thing called paternal leakage, which means that every so often you will acquire your father's mitochondria rather than your mother's. But biology plays pretty fast and loose with whatever rules we try and burden it with. And because it's also very small, mitochondria, it's only 16,000 base pairs, where for a lot of the domestic animals and for humans, we're talking about 3 billion base pairs. So it's a much tighter, smaller unit. And it's just easier to analyze because of the way that it evolves. It's a much more simplistic system. And that means, and the other thing is that from an ancient perspective, it's much more readily acquirable because there's just so much more of it in the bones that remain in archaeological sites. So very often, if you are struggling to recover nuclear DNA, you can very easily capture at least a mitochondrial genome and be able to assign that to a particular clade or a particular signature that for a nuclear genome is going to be much harder to do, simply because you're talking about many fewer changes over a much larger genome, which requires a lot more effort to try and generate. So there are downsides, though, of course, because it is just a single locus. And of course, mitochondria, if it's clonal and just goes down one line, you're not looking at a population that you are looking at. I mean, your nuclear genome is a combination of all of your ancestors have ever combined to produce you. So if we just look at your nuclear genome, we're really getting a snapshot of your entire deep time ancestry. Whereas mitochondria, we're just getting you and your mom's mom and kind of going back from there with not very many changes, if at all, over the last couple of generations. Having said that, so there will be biases, and there's lots of ways in which mitochondrial genome patterns will not reflect the actual evolutionary history that is much more better reflected in a nuclear genome. But I mean, having done this for 20 years, yeah, we do see that from time to time. And when you do, that's interesting. But quite often you see real correspondence between a mitochondrial story that's coming off of a tree and a nuclear genome ancestry pattern. So it's not too crazy often, at least as a first hypothesis, to put forward a pattern that you see from the mitochondria and then use that to test the pattern that you see in the interpretation and the inference that you're gleaning from that when you then look at a nuclear genome. And the other nice thing about mitochondria is that people have been generating it for a long time. So you can go into GenBank now, and there are hundreds of thousands of mitochondrial genomes taken from both modern and ancient populations of most whatever taxa you're pretty much interested in. And so that means you have a much larger database that you can compare it against to make some inferences. There are still quite a few species out there for which there is not that much nuclear DNA, and so therefore it's difficult. I mean, it's changing now quite a lot because of how easy it is to sequence things in a way that it wasn't even just 10 years ago. So, but mitochondria is it's the stalwart. It's been there for a long time. People understand it. It's easy to comprehend, easy to both interpret and misinterpret, but it's there, and it at least forms the basis for an initial hypothesis development about the spread and timing and emergence of different mitochondrial signatures, which we conflate with populations to try and understand the movement of humans and our domestic animals through time and space.
So I'm sure that the fact that we domesticated certain species of animals also had an impact on our own evolution, particularly also because we started consuming them and some of their own products. So, I mean, first of all, is that true? And if so, Since we're focusing here a little bit on genetics, is it that by studying our own genetics, we can also get some insights into how animal domestication might have played out or not?
Absolutely, yeah. Like any relationship between any two partners will necessarily both will change in order to kind of accommodate or to take advantage of that relationship. I mean, the classic one with humans and animals is lactose tolerance. So most of just every animal on or every mammal on Earth drinks milk during when you're a juvenile, and that the gene that affords that possibility to digest that particular to digest milk turns off, so that when you grow out and when you're no longer a juvenile, you no longer retain the ability to digest lactase, which is what's in the milk in the first place. In humans, we see there are some populations, and it looks like it's arisen on multiple occasions, as many as 5 or 6 or even 7, I think, in different populations, where what happens is you acquire a mutation that stops the gene that would otherwise make that ability turn off, and it just gets rid of that. So you retain your juvenile, or at least very early, ability to digest milk all the way through adulthood. And that gene appears to have been under some pretty positive selection, or at least the story is always changing, but it's a very nice example of how, certainly in Northern Europe, and in other places in East Africa and on the Saudi Peninsula and in South Asia, where you have populations that have a very high proportion of this allele that allows you to continue to drink milk well into adulthood, that seems to have gone to either fixation or pretty close to fixation in populations. And the question then is, when does that happen, and what are the mechanisms that's driving that selection? But what is not in question is that it allows us to drink milk, and we're drinking a lot of milk because we're getting that from those other animals. If you don't have that close relationship with cows, with goats, with camels, all of which we are drinking the milk from, the likelihood is that you certainly wouldn't see that significant increase in the proportion of people that have that SNP that allows them to continue to drink the milk, because nobody be drinking milk. So there is something about that's changing us. But again, you can live a perfectly good, normal life without being lactose intolerant. In fact, that's what every other mammal on Earth is, and they're just totally fine. So it's just this interesting, it's not absolutely necessary, but it's an interesting consequence of an outcome of a relationship, and by the way, we're not drinking that milk right away. That's something that happens much later on as a part of that kind of knock-on accidental byproduct of that relationship that develops over thousands of years. So it's not like we see an animal, we go and we grab its udder and we start milking it right away, and then suddenly we all have this gene. No, that's not what happens. But it is interesting that there are populations with a very high proportion of those people who are able to drink milk further into adulthood, and that is purely as a consequence of having had these close relationships with these animals for a very long time.
And I mean, it's not that we start drinking their milk right away, and it's also not the case that we evolve lactose tolerance right away as well. I mean,
or that we necessarily evolve lactose tolerance in order to drink that milk, right? Because how evolution always works is that you're never doing anything in advance of a novel thing that you're going to take advantage of, or a novel threat, or a novel thing that you need to avoid. It's always, what have you got right now? And then, oh, look, there's this. And so the people who had that gene already and then were able to drink the milk, maybe that conferred some other benefit. And it just happened to be the milk was also part of the package that allowed them that drove up that selection pressure. It's hard to say. I mean, it's very easy for us to, from the perspective of the present, recognize the value of something right now and then assume that that's why it was important in the past. And that's just never the case, either in human history or in evolutionary biology.
Yeah, I mean, the way that evolution plays out is that there's variability among individuals, and then in that particular case of lactose tolerance, there were perhaps a few people who had that gene variant that predisposes them to having lactose tolerance, and then over time, since probably they had some sort of fitness advantage, the gene increased in frequency in specific populations alongside the corresponding trait of lactose tolerance.
And what's interesting about that to me is that what's always worth asking the question is, what other benefits might that have had? Because it's entirely possible that the selection would have been driven by something else, and then you get the accident of being able to drink milk, so you just do that. But we now assign that as the cause, when in fact it's just a byproduct of it. In the same way that, a classical, canonical, or very simplistic, and I would argue overly simplistic view of human evolution that I remember from school growing up was that there was a whole bunch of monkeys, and they were living in trees, and then the trees dried up because we had this drying process, and so that then all the monkeys in the trees were like, oh, I know, we should start being bipedal, because then we can walk across the savannah. We don't have to go through the canopy and climb from tree to tree. So then somebody was like, oh, I know, I think we should grow this ability to become bipedal so that we can walk across the landscape. And of course, that's not what happened. The bipedalism was already present. It was just that the landscape afforded a place to be able to do that, so because they were already doing it somewhere else. So it was, and it's that classic thing where, I mean, it's the Gouldian idea that, and he said it much better than I can ever quite recall it, but it's the whole idea that you cannot equate modern utility with historical origin, right? Just because it's useful for something right now doesn't mean that that's why it came to be in the first place. And that's true of a whole adaptationist perspective on evolution in general, but also to do with domestication. And that we tend to now say, and the classic one is, oh, like you just referenced, we eat a lot of these animals. Well, it turns out that when you start looking at all the archaeology, we were not, and so the presupposition is, like, especially with chickens or with pigs or whatever else, like or cows, we therefore went and started grabbing these things because we wanted to eat them, and that's what kickstarted the domestication process. But if you look at the archaeology, these animals are around people for a long time before we have anything to do with eating them. The eating is like very, very late in this process. But because we eat a lot of them now, we assume that that's what we were doing, and that's why it started in the first place. And it's just not true. So we make this mistake perpetually, and we are loath to correct it for some reason. We just keep assuming it all the time, and it's not a very good prior, but we keep holding on to it.
By the way, and since that's the case that we didn't really start eating animals right away, do we have any idea, is there any explanation as to why we started domesticating them?
So I think right within your question is already a bias that is true of like all humans, right? Because what you said is do we know why we started doing this? And that presupposes that we did this intentionally. That there was a bunch of people that they were animals, and they were like, hey, we should do this because in a couple thousand years, our ancestors are really going to want a cockapoo, or they're going to want a double-muscled cow. And if we start now, we can get the really big cows, and then or udders that produce milk, and then that's where they're going to drink all the milk out of the udders. I mean, when you really think about it, drinking the milk of another species is a weird. I mean, we all freak out. Like if I gave you a glass right now and said, "Here's some milk from, I don't know, a friend of yours who just had a baby, drink this," you'd be like, are you kidding me? No, I'm not going to drink. I mean, maybe on some niche thing on eBay or whatever, but like, that's weird. But if I hand you a glass of cow's milk, you're, oh yeah, sure, that's delicious. It's just weird. Like it's so culturally embedded that we take it for granted. And there's this idea that that we use this word, the word domesticate it's a verb and a noun. Right? We can describe it as a characteristic. This animal is domesticated. But when we say domesticate, we immediately infer that it's a transitive verb, that it's something that we are doing. We are the subject, the humans, and whatever animal we're talking about is the object of that process. And that immediately puts us in the framework of we're doing this, or our ancestors did this because they were smart, they were goal-directed, they knew how successful this is going to be, and they thought, right, the last 300,000 years of human history have been just a bit of a waste. We're all been hunter-gatherers, not very many of us. But as soon as we go out and we grab these animals and we start eating them, that's going to form the foundation for a huge number of humans. And by 2023, there's going to be 8 billion people on Earth. It's going to be great. But that's clearly not how it worked. And so, but again, I think it's that we are presupposing that because our civilization, I hate using that word, but because modern human societies very often rely upon this bedrock of domestic animals and the consumption thereof, that therefore that's why this whole process happened. And there we start asking questions about why did we do this? Well, if not to eat them, then why did we do this? But it still is supposing that we did this for a reason. And it's like, I don't know. So let me give you an example. Okay. We published a paper on chickens last year where it looks like the very first site at which we start archaeologically seeing those proxies, those signatures of lots of chicken bones that you wouldn't necessarily expect relative to the other animals that are there, lots of juvenile chicken bones, and lots of and skewed sex ratios and all these kinds of other signatures, which appears to be there's a lot of chickens living with the people. Happens to coincide in peninsular Southeast Asia, specifically in Thailand at a site called Bon Non Wat, with the arrival of a tradition of wet rice agriculture. So you have this ecological impact of wet rice, which requires a significant transformation of the landscape, but which happens also to look like a plot that has strands which the red jungle fowl that were living there at the time would recognize, because they often go for the bamboo. So you have these big bamboo sprouts, which are happening all the time, and rice kind of in this particular context operates in a similar way. So the red jungle fowl who are in the trees are not thinking of this as like, oh, look, there's this novel source of protein that we can get from the grains now. But so it's not bamboo, but it looks very much the same. So it's more that the red jungle fowl in that area start getting attracted to it, and it coincides perfectly with the arrival of the wet rice. Once they're then associated with those people, and you form that relationship, then those people start moving in different directions, first with wet rice, and then the chickens are associated with the people. Now you can change out the grain. So it becomes much later on barley, much before that becomes wheat, and you've got a whole series of other grains as well. So it's like the red jungle fowl come for the grain, that's the part of the wet rice, but then get associated with humans, and then they start consuming the other grain as well. But it's this classic thing like with cats. It's like, oh, we didn't domesticate them, they domesticated us. Ha ha ha. It's almost like we have to have one partner leading it. But this is not how human relationships work, right? You don't target somebody to go out and domesticate or make your spouse or whatever. There is a mutualism here. There are two actors in all of this. And what appears to be happening is that you have an opportunity for the red jungle fowl to kind of, as it were, invade the human niche where they're taking advantage of a resource, and then those people start forming relationships with what then become chickens. But what's curious is that we don't see any evidence for them eating chickens until at least when they get to Europe 500 years after their arrival. So when they first arrive, they're being buried first as individuals, as old individuals, as incomplete individuals. If you're eating a bird, that's not how you would expect to find them in the archaeological record. Then they're even being buried with people as grave goods. And there's a particular site where the men are buried with cocks, the women are buried with hens, and it looks like they're buried with their own chickens. And so they're sort of acting like as a psychopump, as a way to kind of transition to the next world, not as a foodstuff, but as a kind of supernatural thing. And then they get associated with the Catholic Church, and they're on the top of church steeples, they're on coins, they're everywhere. It's the national symbol of France. It's like these things are revered as animals. They're coming from a long way away. They look like nothing else. They are within human society. This is an important thing. 500 years later, after their arrival, that's when you start to see chickens showing up on archaeological sites as individual bone fragments, where you got the cut marks, you got the important bones that have the larger meat on them. But even then, they're not being consumed in the way that we're eating them now, where we're making them grow 3 times faster so that we kill them after 30 days. And it gets crazy. So what's really curious is that as soon as they're introduced in Europe, and it takes a while for them to move kind of northern from the Mediterranean up to Scotland, when they first arrive, people are like, oh my God, look at this thing. And then the clock starts, and then 500 years later, they're eating them. But by the time they're already eating them in Italy, in Scotland, when they're arriving, they're like, oh my God, what is this? Everybody's freaking out. They're like, we can't eat this. This is too it. It would be like if aliens landed on Earth today, you're not going to eat them. You're going to marvel at how incredible they are and how distant they are. But then once we start eating them, and then after World War II, when we start really eating them and they become the predominant source of protein for the human population on Earth, that's when our brains start going, oh, we domesticated chickens because we knew that in 3,500 years that everybody started eating them. And this is not how it works. And what happens with that is that if we presuppose that, that means that we willfully blind ourselves to asking the question of, we're eating them now as a consequence of this long-term relationship, but this is a byproduct of how that relationship formed. If we're assuming that we ate them the whole time, that eliminates all questions about their origins, which means we're not curious, which means we have no idea how this relationship starts. And that's going to be true of every animal. And I have a good colleague and friend who suspects that far from us eating the animals as the driver, we were actually feeding animals. And you can see this with reindeer and with salt licks and cows. And so it's like you're kind of drawing them towards you, or by accident that you recognize where they are. And there's this relationship that's forming where the whole eating of the animals is actually something that's taking place a very long time after that relationship starts, which means we very often are not asking the questions about how does that relationship then start, and why then, and why there, and what's going on, and why not for the previous 250, 300,000 years of our species, when there seems to be no evidence of this kinds of deep time relationships where we're actually then moving into a source where we become mutually dependent on one another. So yeah, for a very long time, I don't think we've been asking the right questions.
Okay, great. But then, I mean, talking about those early stages of the relationships that develop between humans and certain other species of animals, you gave the examples of chickens there. I mean, how should we understand then those initial stages? Is it already some sort of domestication? I mean, before people started eating them or using some of their products for their own consumption, and perhaps at a certain time intentionally started breeding them in particular ways. So before all of that happened, can we say that there's already a domestication process going on? Are there, for example, already particular physical, anatomical, or behavioral changes that we can see occurring in those animals?
And that's a great question. And that's one of the reasons why it's been difficult to think about domestication in this way, is because very often the early stages of a relationship don't leave much of a kind of a record or an impact in either the archaeological, the paleontological, the genetic, the isotopic record. Like, you don't really see it. Like, and one thing I like about this is a fun analogy is that there's this great article in the Atlantic recently about how and everybody will recognize this. Like, if you're in a relationship with somebody else, you often, when you think about the origins of that relationship, it's always in retrospect, right? Nobody says you have to date somebody for a while before you're allowed to have a first date, like, or before you're allowed to have an anniversary date. You only have an anniversary with those people who you've dated long enough in order to make that first date important enough. You have a lot of first dates maybe, or a lot of kind of meeting people initially, but putting a beginning on it only happens well after the fact, when the beginning becomes relevant, because a lot of first dates go nowhere, in which case you don't have an anniversary with that person. You just had a first date. So the first date is irrelevant until it becomes important well after the fact, which means that if we're thinking about that kind of, if humans and animals are in these relationships, that first date, what is that going to look like? Right? Like, it's not Tinder. So what is it? Like, how and what proxies can we even begin to think about what it might look like when we're only now placing importance upon it? And how many first dates were there? So there's some classic literature about gazelles in the Near East, where some people have said that humans were auditioning gazelles for domestication, as though they were like, you're doing an interview, right? Like, well, you guys, gazelles, you're kind of quick, and there's a lot of you, and you live in these herds, and we could hunt you if we kind of direct you down this focus, and then we can shoot all of you at once. We have a big feast with a whole lot of gazelle, but it never then goes anywhere, so that, you don't have a gazelle in your backyard. And, they're probably more in zoos than they are on menus. And so how much of that early relationship with gazelles is now discarded because it didn't get to the point where we have gazelle farms, but how much of it was intentional by the people in order to accomplish something that looked like what they might call, or what we would now call, domestication. And I suppose what I'm saying is that if we don't even know what we're looking for, how do we know what we've found? And what questions are we asking about the very beginning of it? And I think when we start to think about the kinds of questions that we should be asking, so the question is, what questions should we ask? Then we can at least start to have some kind of clear idea, because beginnings are always fuzzy and weird and only relevant in retrospect. And this is so with the dogs, for example. There are people who will say, and who've been looking at dogs for a long time and have been thinking about this deeply for a long time, who will say the only way you get dog domestication is if you have some hunter-gatherers anywhere between 15 and 30,000 years ago. They know where the wolves are in the landscape. They know where the wolf dens are, because they're not ignorant about their entire ecology. They're smart people, because they're just like us, you and me. Probably smarter, because if you put me out there in the Siberian landscape, I got no idea what I'm doing. But it's part of the culture. It's part of what's happening. They know where the wolf dens are. They know when the female's been in there for a while. They then know when the female is left. They go in, they grab 2 or 3 wolf pups aged 6 weeks. They bring them back to camp. They breastfeed them and they raise them, right when they're first opening their eyes and the whole thing. And thereby you get domestic dogs. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that bugs me. Because I think what it's doing is it's relying heavily on this idea that we did this intentionally and that's the way to do it. Now, they're not wrong, because another group of people says, well, actually, it's more unintentional. That what you have is you have a group of people on a landscape, and then you just have a population of wolves that start becoming reliant on that human niche, on that human impact, whether that is a carcass that people left behind, or whether that's some other sort of waste products that people were in. So the wolves start following the people, or kind of accompany them on hunts, or know what they're doing, and you end up having this, again, mutual relationship where you see both species see benefits in hanging out together, and then that embeds or endears them to each other, and then they become very important. And then what you see in the Mesolithic, certainly in southern Scandinavia and Japan and in southeast corner of the US, is that these dogs in a way become people, where they are buried as individuals with grave goods in the same place where they're burying people. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they are sufficiently important within those human communities to be recognized upon death in the same way that you would recognize another person. And that's happening in 3 different places in the world. So this relationship forms and is absolutely essential. And we have this now. More than a quarter of all households in the UK have a dog. So this is a thing. But did that happen because we wanted dogs, or did the dogs and the humans sort of accidentally form this relationship, which is how we form all relationships? And if it was an accident, what were the circumstances that led to it in that particular place and time, and when was that and where was that? And those are questions that, if you say that it's just going out and grabbing some pups because you knew that was going to be important, I think it cuts off other lines of inquiry that I think are more valuable and ultimately more rewarding, and probably for me closer to the actual truth of what happened. But we could be asking all those same questions of camels, of cows, of sheep, of goats, of guinea pigs, of alpacas, of wild boar, all these different animals that have become more important to us now, or fallow deer, a whole bunch of all kinds of different deer, a whole bunch of different animals with which we have had changing dynamic relationships with over the last 15 to 20,000 years, in some cases being very important at certain times. There's Mesolithic communities in Portugal that were 80% of the faunal remains that you see at these sites are rabbits. There's a whole bunch of rabbits on the landscape. They have a whole bunch of these. They're eating a lot of these things, it appears. Is that domestication, or is it just like there is this relationship there where they're actually, maybe they weren't eating them to start, but we're not even asking that question. I don't know. The point is that for a very long time, we have presupposed that we knew why people were doing this, and then we're asking those questions, when in fact, I'm not sure that's the right thing to be doing.
Okay, so let me ask you a different kind of question then. So different kinds of researchers like geneticists, archaeologists, evolutionary biologists, and others who do work on domestication, I mean, the way you understand domestication, does it necessarily have to have some intentionality behind it? Or, I mean, because I was asking you about those early stages of the relationship between humans and these other animal species, before they started intentionally breeding them or something like that. Do you already call that domestication? I mean, before the intentional part, let's say, comes in, or not? Or is it... should we call it something else?
That's I think as a shorthand, we all know what domestication is. We all have an intuition for it. We look around the world around us. We know which animals are domestic and which ones are not, right? And we fill our literature this. All of our children's stories and all of our there's wolves permeate Little Red Riding Hood, or it's all kinds of fairy tales have domestic and wild, and the dichotomy and the whole thing. We know what this is. But I think that most academics that I've spoken to who have nothing to do with what I do will have often said the same thing, which is that the word that everybody understands is often the least helpful word when actually trying to understand the phenomenon in the first place. And I have taken to, we're playing now with another paper around this idea of definitions and domestication and the whole thing, but from my own research, I dispense with it on a day-to-day basis. It's not helpful or useful to me because it has so much baggage and presupposes so many things that everybody takes for granted without actually really questioning. And so I prefer relationship. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean about this. So in Japan, starting about 100 years ago, there are these wasps that live in the forest, and I think of it like as a bee scenario. We have a queen and then a population around, and a queen will start a new colony in the bark of a tree and produce a large population of wasps that then do waspy things. Yeah. For about 100 years ago, people started having a penchant for getting the larvae of the wasps and eating those. And so they were then kind of, for lack of a better phrase, kind of harvesting them. So you would go into the forest, you would identify where these are, and then you would grab some larvae and you come back and you incorporate them into your cuisine. And, people might go, oh, gross, wasp larva. But again, we drink cow's milk. So, I don't think we can hold a candle to this. It's fine. So then it becomes enough of a particular big deal where then every winter, depending on the severity of the winter, a number of these colonies would die out because it would get too cold, or they just over a long enough period of time, or something would happen where the population would have less of them the following spring or summer to be able to go out and harvest. Well, people kind of liked this. So what they started doing is they got into the material culture game and started building wooden, almost think of again like a beehive. They started erecting these wooden things and deliberately putting queens into them to make them ideal circumstances so they could overwinter more readily. So they're shifting the selection pressure on this, because now you have wasp colonies that are surviving that wouldn't have otherwise without the human intervention. And again, so this is for eating them, but only for eating the larvae, not for the other population. And it's a relatively small thing. Yeah. What's curious about this is then it starts to increase in size. And for me, what's interesting is it's almost a two-stage thing. First of it is the consumption of the larva, and then trying to increase the frequency of that larva through time by accommodating or like mitigating the detrimental effects of a harsh winter. So you have more of them the following season. But then, curiously, there was also these kind of the equivalent of like the American State Fair, where you don't just come to marvel at the things that you're eating, whether that's the pigs or the sheep or the cows or the pumpkins or the various other produce. You're there to compete to see who can grow the biggest one, right? And it's this classic thing. So the State Fair largest pumpkin gets a prize, the biggest squash gets a prize. And it was the same thing. They start playing with these larvae to such a degree, like who could grow the biggest larva. So now that's a different thing. Now you're competing for size, which is not really about eating it. Now there's a whole cultural thing embedded in all of this. Yeah. And then researchers go out and they give these people questionnaires, and they're talking to them, and they ask them very explicitly, was it your deliberate intention to domesticate these wasp larvae? And everyone's like, no, like that's not this whole term. A, no intentionality. B, we never thought of this as like a domestic thing or a domestication thing. But if you look at it, how is this any different than anything that we would currently regard as domestic? You are changing allele frequencies by shifting selection pressures. You are making conditions separate for harvesting a population to use them for one reason or another, which is then embedding this relationship between the human population and these wasps on the same time. And maybe in retrospect, it looks like this is a domestication event, but as it's happening, you just want some more wasps. So you're doing that you're changing the circumstances of their survival in order for you to have more the following season. And that's what I mean about the word not being relevant. Because nobody woke up one morning and was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to domesticate these guys. Domestication in this case is only a description, and maybe not even a very apt description, or in some cases a very apt description, because it's just precisely doing what we have talked about with the key components of all the rest of the animals that we consider to be domestic, but they're not doing it with the intentionality of that word and specifically. So, which is why then, if you went to say, like, if we're asking ourselves, why did we domesticate dogs? We could say, well, why did we domesticate wasp larvae? And they were like, well, we didn't actually domesticate them. We were just kind of harvesting them for a while. You see what I'm saying? But even that is a little bit misleading, because that also presupposes that the entire thing was predicated upon cuisine and eating and consumption, which, as I was describing with chickens, isn't the case. And so you have to be aware of the biases you're bringing to all of this. So I think that the word is it's fabulously helpful and hugely problematic all at the same time, because any word that has this much imbued or understood meaning is necessarily going to be loaded with unquestioned assumptions about process, about intentionality, and about all these other things that therefore never get questioned, regardless of the kinds of how deeply embedded you are in this research. And that for me is a problem, which is why it's been a lot of fun just to get rid of the word. It's like an academic thing too, right? You are whatever you study, you're super cool if you say it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and also I think that you've already touched a little bit on this point as well. But I guess that perhaps another thing that people have to keep in mind, and perhaps more the general population than the researchers themselves, I would imagine. But I mean, of course, we tend also to think that perhaps when people intentionally started breeding animals, initially just because perhaps the animals were living with them and out of convenience, so okay, so I'm going to start breeding them to have access to their meat and their eggs and other dairy products and all of that. But I mean, of course, back then when they started doing that, they didn't have in mind a particular. I mean, they didn't have in mind making the animals evolve in a particular way to get the chickens that we have now, or the cows, or the pigs that we have now. I mean, they probably at the beginning just started breeding them to get their meat, and then perhaps over time and with cultural, cumulative culture that we have, we ended up learning about how we could breed the animals in specific ways.
Sure. But and that's what I mean about as soon as the way in which that relationship shifts. So let's go back to the chickens and the eating. We eat an absolute ton of chickens now. I mean, a rather scary amount of chickens are dying every day for our benefit, who can't even stand up after 30 days because they're now 3 times as big as they were just 50, 60 years ago. So we are putting an enormous amount of selection on getting them to grow faster, making that feed conversion ratio so that the food we give them goes straight into developing the protein on their breast meat. So it's just, we are shifting these birds over a very short period of time to kind of push the possibilities of what is biologically and evolutionarily possible. But if our focus is exclusively on how we interrelate with them now, that time depth is going to have nothing to do with the earlier time depth at a time when we had a relationship with chickens, which had nothing to do with eating them. Yep. And so and I suspect that's going to be true of just about every animal. And, people go, oh, you're crazy. We were hunting things. Yes, we were hunting things, but there was also ways in which people were associating with animals that had nothing to do with hunting, but were still revered in some way, or were still part of their iconography, or still part of the amount of effort that people would put in about how they associated with the natural world. There's lots of other ways, and even now there's lots of relationships we have with things that we're completely ignorant of. All of the skin bacteria, or all of the E. coli, and all of the microbiomes that exist within your nasal cavity and under your arm and everywhere else on you, that we have these mutually interdependent relationships that some people are now using the word domesticated to describe, but you would never say that you domesticated your own microbiome when you came out of your mother's womb, right? Like, that's just not a word we would, but people, that's what I mean. Like, what are the limits of this word to describe the relationships in general, and what are other ways in which this relationship gets started and perpetuates that has nothing to do with how we now view or consume those animals in modern day 2023 global populations of animals and humans?
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you about another thing that I haven't asked you about yet. So can we also use animal domestication to study human dispersal? I mean, from the time we got out of Africa to populating Eurasia, Oceania, and then the Americas, can we use animal domestication as a source to perhaps get a better understanding of the timing of human dispersal, for example?
Absolutely, yeah, and that's what's fun. And this is where I think mitochondria still has some value. And I say still, it always has and it always will. Like, it's another line of evidence. And, I've got a colleague who would say, why would you not use a line of evidence? Like, if you have some stuff, even if you know that the more aware you are of its biases, you can still use it, right? We had a paper a couple years ago where I think it was just a really fun thing to do, where we know from an ancient DNA perspective that there were dogs in the Americas. And when we first started getting both the mitochondria and then the nuclear signatures from these dogs in the Americas that preceded or predated the arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century, all of these dogs had both the mitochondria and nuclear signature that had no relationship, or we couldn't find anywhere else in Eurasia or in Africa or anywhere that dogs, Australia, anywhere that dogs are now. And which suggested that dogs they were closely related to Eurasian dogs, but they had unique signatures which appeared to have emerged after they arrived into the Americas. So we then got a whole bunch of mitochondrial sequences from these things. And then we're able to, because mitochondria is relatively easy to date, especially if we've got full mitochondrial genomes, and we had direct radiocarbon dates from these samples, so we could internally calibrate the trees and say, okay, this sequence came from this time, so what does that mean about the timing of the node that connects this animal, or this dog and this dog? And we did that for all the dogs. And we found that all of the dogs, the time to the most recent common ancestor that was at the base of the tree, that linked all of the dogs that were the original dogs in the Americas, was about 15, 16,000 years ago. We then do that exact same analysis for the humans, but completely independently. We don't link them, and we're not using any priors from the dogs to look at the humans, and the dates come out exactly the same. And it's just, or at least within, when you look at your confidence intervals, they're basically lining up. And what that suggests very neatly is that the population of both people and dogs that were, firstly, they came in at about the same time, and then they spread looking like along similar trajectories and acquiring new mutations, which allows them to be distinctive and relative to the old world, the Eurasian populations. And that it kind of fits. And so it starts to ask this question: did humans need dogs to come in? But when they did come in, they definitely had dogs. And then you can start to get into the nitty gritty of like, okay, we can distinguish this lineage from this lineage. And if we look at the phylogeography of where that exists in space and time, we can start working out where those people and those dogs went. We can use one as the proxy for the other. And that starts to get really fun. And we've got a paper that we're working on right now where we start to look at through Central and South America, where again, we're seeing this classic stepping stone thing, which is the same thing we see in the chickens and the same thing we see in other places, where you get a winnowing of the total amount of variability as you go through areas where there's just not a whole lot of stuff that's going through, especially when you're going north and south, which is much harder than going east and west. And we can put dates on that too, and we can then wiggle match that to the emergence or the first appearance of agriculture in those regions, or maize, or any material culture, and all kinds of other stuff. So I mean, what's been a whole lot of, we've done this for pigs as well, where we can see there's a very distinctive mitochondrial signature that Polynesians take into the Pacific, which is very different than the one that we're finding in most other East Asian pigs. And so you can start to assign mitochondrial signatures or haplotypes to specific populations in space and time, and then work out when and how they got where they are, because very often it's the population that's with humans that have distinctive signatures relative to the ones that are not associated with people, and then you can start to use them as proxies for each other. And it's been great. And we were doing the same thing with rats and with cats and with all, you name an animal, and the likelihood is that we are having a lot of fun with the mitochondria right now, doing exactly this, like working out the timings and working out the specific groups of people with whom they're moving.
And by the way, by studying that, can we also get a better understanding as to if people really needed those domesticated animals for them to be able to disperse across particular regions of the globe?
Yeah, it's a good question about sort of the reliance, right? I mean, because, and sort of the necessity on which, so if you have dogs and people coming at the same time, did people need dogs? It's a fun story. Polynesians make their way into the Pacific. They had chickens, they had pigs, and they had dogs. But on some islands, all three made it. On other islands, only two of the three. And on some islands, just one of them. So were they absolutely necessary? Maybe not, but was a kind of convenient package to start with. And then you can see how those three animals in concert with the people and the material culture as well made it to different islands all the way throughout the Pacific. So the necessity is a great question, I think, that can follow on from the pattern. And then you can make inferences from that about frequency that you find them together and everything else. But I suspect in all of these cases, those relationships were pretty essential, or at least they were so embedded within those human cultures that they came to rely on them to such a degree that it became kind of, it's one unit, right? It's one thing that's happening. In the same way that if, and I love this about like human diet, like you can eat, you could subsist on a whole lot of different stuff, but you don't eat everything. You have a very particular idea of what breakfast is supposed to consist of. Yeah. And that might be savory and that might be sweet. And maybe you might vary that through the week a little, but if you go to a different part of the world where breakfast is a radically different thing, you're not going to change that quickly. Like that becomes embedded. And I think it's the same thing with animals, because you develop a particular life way around things like, for example, herding. If you are based upon this is who you are, and somebody comes along and says you are no longer allowed to herd those animals, what does that do to your community? Because that's how you now project yourself to the outside environment. And we see this in lots of cases, like in the Americas, where you've got an invading population, and everybody can be very good at this. If you have we have examples where in North America, there were North American tribes that were forced to take up herding and become pastoralists when they had no history of this. But it's a way to kind of erase people's identity, to say you do this now because we can make you do this because we are the controlling power. And so it becomes a kind of a source of power and influence to determine what your relationships are with certain animals, because you now have to learn a completely different way of life, which bears no relationship to your ancestry, which means you sever all of that, which means you're now much more readily controllable. And you're subjecting them and oppressing them, right? And you do this by altering your relationships. Imagine if somebody came to you and said, well, your relationship with your partner is over, you now have to date this person. You'd be like, I don't want to do that. Doesn't matter, we're making you do it. It's like, how much would that change who you are? And that becomes an interesting thing as well. So it's as much, so I think because these relationships are so embedded and we take them for granted and become so reliant upon them, you can use them as proxies to look at populations of people moving around. And I know that, for example, Tina Warner is looking at this in Harvard, where it's not just the animal itself, it's all the products of a lot of fermentation to do with cheeses and yogurts and milks and all kinds of things, and what animals go into what and how all of that works. Or, for example, in Italy, where you have mozzarella, right, where it can only come from water buffalo. Well, the closest water buffalo population that is indigenous to Italy is in South Asia, right? How on earth, what is the process by which water buffalo, A, get to Italy, B, become the only way you're allowed to make mozzarella? Like, that makes no sense, none whatsoever. And yet, in order to have proper mozzarella, it has to come from a water buffalo, and that becomes a thing. It's a very important thing, probably because it's come from so far away. So you can start to make these inferences about the pattern of which, and the other story I've heard about this, it's anecdotal, so I'm not sure how true this is, but that when they move the water buffalo, water buffalo first start moving, they do so without the people who actually had that relationship, but they realized that they couldn't actually milk them very well. They couldn't get the various cheeses. They had no idea what they were doing. So they were the people who, when they brought the water buffalo, they had to bring the people as well, because those are the only people who had the knowledge to make the product from the animal that everybody was clamoring for. And that becomes it's like having a special formula for like Coca-Cola or something, right? They're not going to give that away because that's an important signifying thing for that population. In the same way that the only way you can get proper mozzarella is not just to have the water buffalo, you need the people who know how to do it as well. And that's a significant thing, because that relationship had probably built up over a long period of time.
Great. So I'm getting mindful of your time. So let me just ask you one last question then. And I guess that over the course of our conversation, you've already touched on some of these, but what would you say are some of the main challenges of research on animal domestication? I mean, with the tools that we have, not only the technological tools, but with the methodologies from the different areas that we have, what would you say are some of the main challenges and limitations?
So I think, kind of following on from what we've been talking about, I think a significant challenge is the kind of challenge that most people aren't thinking of, and that's the kind of the cognitive biases that we bring to the study of domestication in the first place. People are often very convinced that they know what it is, that they've already got an idea of what they're expecting to see, and they kind of have a feel for this word domestic, domesticate, whatever, that it starts kind of bleeding into all kinds of other fields without a proper understanding of what it actually means. So for me, I sort of loathe this idea that there's now at least 7 different ways in which you can append the word domestic to modify it in such a way that's supposed to have meaning, but for me doesn't. So there's self-domestication, there's proto-domestication, there's semi-domestication, there's super-domestication. I mean, it's just for me, it's just a bit crazy. Like, why are we appending a word that has already kind of such loose meaning anyway, that's not specific, and then making it even less specific? It's a bit insane. So I think that there are the way in which we perceive, or we think we perceive the word, is actually acting as a boundary or as a preventative thing rather than facilitating a study for proper understanding. It's stopping us from doing so, which is weird because in the face of new technology, as you rightly point out, I mean, the sequencing power that we've got now relative to just a decade ago, much less 2 decades ago when I was doing my PhD, is insane. So, and the isotopic fractions that we can get now, from not just different elements, but kind of going all the way down to like single molecules of things. It's amazing. And geometric morphometrics now, rather than just kind of length and width on a bone that we can get, that's giving us additional resolving power. And that's really what's happening, is that the archaeological science techniques are developing a much more sophisticated way of looking at this, simply because we've got more data, and therefore we can resolve differences, much finer scale differences between two individuals, two individual elements, two individual populations, whatever it is. We're getting a massive data, but we don't necessarily have the framework to think about how to interpret that data. We are, however, getting much better at integrating that data across many different disciplines simultaneously. And that's what people have been, that's been a lot of fun to see, where you have archaeologists and archaeological scientists and evolutionary biologists all sharing that data and talking about it from different perspectives and starting to develop a much bigger picture about all these different things. And not just the animals, but then, as you rightly point out, the humans themselves. And I have been loath because, and a lot of people would yell at me for this, I haven't mentioned plants at all, right? There's like a huge, rich, and very important questions about and databases about plants that need to be asked at the same time, right? We're talking about environments, we're talking about impacts, we're talking about ecologies, and we're talking about relationships. And you don't just have one relationship with something, you've got dozens. So it's the material culture, it's the plants, it's the animals, it's the people, it's the kind of way in which you are either harvesting or scything or having an ecological impact on the environment, using whatever tools that you're using that are having impacts on various selection processes. And, it's just, everything's changing. And it's changing because you've got this dynamism as a result of all the interconnected complex relationships between all these different things. And until you are starting to integrate all of that, you're probably not really getting a true understanding of what's actually happening. So that's always the goal. We're not always very good at getting there. It's hard, and it's a lot of work, and it's just so easier to be myopic on your one technique. And like we run an ancient DNA facility, so we have an ancient DNA shaped hammer, and so we kind of think of everything as an ancient. All the questions are ancient DNA shaped nails, and we just pound everything with it, hoping to get it. But we are hopefully making some inroads with a lot of collaborations with a lot of brilliant people, trying to integrate many more data sets, sometimes more successfully than others. But I think that's clearly the way forward. So it's both the intellectual kind of questioning of our own assumptions, as well as considering how we can incorporate as many different data sets simultaneously to really try and get to the heart of what's been going on for the last 15 or 20,000 years. Because that's been radically different from what was happening in the previous 200, 300,000 years. And so what changed and why and how and when and it's just all crazy.
Yeah, but even though it's probably more complex and complicated than it might have seemed at first sight, it's also probably more fun, right?
It's more fun because I think we are edging towards something closer to the truth, right? We are, rather than kind of taking the past and imposing our preconceived ideas on what it should be, we are opening up our minds a little bit, expanding the shape of what might have been possible, and actually getting closer to what really took place. Or at least, even if that's incremental and it's small degrees, I would prefer to, and that's the fun part, is actually reconsidering what we think might have happened and insisting that that's what happened, instead going, well, what, maybe we can just get some neurologists throwing a whole bunch of stuff against the wall, seeing what sticks, and coming up with some real insights.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Larson, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. So I'm at Oxford. We've got a website. It's PaleoBARN.com. And that's within the School of Archaeology at Oxford. I've been on Twitter for a long time, but it's just all dumb now. I think I'm just leaving. I just can't take it. It's just silly. So I may or may not be on Twitter in the next couple weeks. So probably not. I haven't tweeted forever now. And otherwise, we've got a lot of popular stories coming out and a lot of academic stuff that we do. But just my name's reasonably unique, so you could, not that there's degrees of uniqueness, of course, but if you type me in, you can find me. You can find out what we're doing.
Okay, great. So I'm leaving links to your work then in the description box of this interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ricardo, for the conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to people who are interested in doing what we're doing. It's very flattering, and it's Rick rolling and just a blast.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Larson, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amari Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.